Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the U.S. House of Representatives has passed the Taiwan Travel Act, which now awaits Senate and presidential endorsement. How will China-U.S. ties evolve if Trump signs this bill? Chinese smartphone maker Huawei has been blocked from entering the U.S. market after a partnership with AT&T broke down. Does this signal American protectionism in the face of Chinese competition? And we want to begin our program today in the U.S., where the House of Representatives passed the two bills relating to Taiwan. The so-called Taiwan Travel Act aims to encourage visits between U.S. and Taiwan functionaries at all levels. China has expressed its strong opposition in response, urging the United States to adhere to the One China policy. To know more, take a look at this.
China-U.S. ties hit a snag. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a Taiwan Travel Act that would allow U.S. government officials to travel to China's Taiwan and meet their counterparts. It also paves the way for high-level Taiwan officials to visit the U.S. and meet American officials. A second bill passed at the same time to strengthen the critical U.S.-Taiwan partnership aims to help Taiwan regain observer status at the World Health Assembly. The Chinese Foreign Ministry responded to this on Thursday.
China is resolutely opposed to this and urges the U.S. side to adhere to the One China policy as well as to the three Sino-U.S. joint communiques and to cautiously deal with related Taiwan issues. The U.S. should avoid any official contacts with the Taiwan authorities and not send any wrong signals to the pro-independence forces in Taiwan. We hope the U.S. can take real action to safeguard the overall interests of bilateral ties as well as China-U.S. cooperation in international issues.
Now the draft is submitted to the Senate. If passed, it will be sent to President Trump for review. If Trump signs the bill, the draft will come into force and become U.S. law. Then it will inevitably lead to the regression of China-U.S. relations.
For more on the so-called Taiwan Travel Act, we are joined in our Beijing studio Zhong Ho Tao, who is a researcher at the Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In Taipei, we are joined by Joanna Lei, former legislator and chief executive officer of the Changhua 21st Century think tank. Welcome. In Washington, D.C., we want to welcome Michael O'Hanlon, who is Director of Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. I want to start with you, Mr. Zhong, because obviously the mainland is reacting very strongly toward the House of Representatives, so-called the Taiwan Travel Act. Is this so-called a dangerous start?
Yes, of course, it represents a very dangerous start. If this bill is passed in future in Senate and signed by Donald Trump, I think it breaks One China policy. That means the political mutual trust between China and the United States ceases to exist, and that is a strong signal or a bad beginning for this China and the U.S. relationship.
I'll ask Mr. O'Hanlon later because he just lost his feed. I'll talk to him later. Let's go to Ms. Lei in Taiwan. Help us understand, because Taiwan has always been used as a bargaining chip by the United States and also in the relations between China and the United States. When things like this happen, this is not the first time either, what does it mean for many of those in Taiwan, intellectuals like you? Ms. Lei.
Well, certainly there are two major reactions. One is from the ruling DPP government. They have been lobbying for the passing of such act or law in the United States, both directly and through FAPA. So FAPA, previous officers such as Anna Liu, Tsai Ing-wen, as well as MOFA, all issued strong statements endorsing and applauding such action made by the U.S. Congress. However, there are also people warning that if Taiwan continues to play into being a bargaining chip or a lever against the mainland China, then it can bring very catastrophic results into Taiwan. So obviously there are two schools of thoughts. One is that this is a welcome change, and the other one says it may put Taiwan further into just a bargaining chip, allowing U.S. to play the Taiwan card against China, and that will not be beneficial to Taiwan.
There are already 6 so-called transitional trips being made by now the leader of Taiwan through the United States.
Yes.
But, Mr. Zhong, there is a very different in nature when we talk about so-called transitional trips made through the United States by those officials coming from Taiwan and those that has been talked about in the Taiwan Travel Act, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. In the past, Tsai Ing-wen, just as you said, made 6 times transitional stop in United States, but that is just a transitional stop, and she did not stop in Washington D.C. or in New York, these very sensitive cities. But if in future this bill is passed and signed by Donald Trump into law, then maybe she has the right to stop in Washington D.C., in New York, and even she has the right to meet with Donald Trump.
And that, of course, would be devastating for the U.S.-China relations, at least coming from the Chinese side. Mr. O'Hanlon, of course, Washington is not stupid at all. I mean, Washington understands very well how much this bargaining chip would work, to what extent it could work, and to what extent China would argue against, or to what extent China would act against. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, why at this time this so-called bill passed by House of Representatives? Should people be alerted, or actually this is, you know, has always been one of those political games?
Well, that last point is important that you just made, because as you know, Congress has had a soft spot in its heart for Taiwan for a long time, and many Americans do as well. Taiwan's an impressive place, and you know, it's a democracy, it's a thriving market economy. And I think to China and Taiwan's credit, they've developed an increasingly good relationship in the last couple of decades. So there's a soft spot in the hearts of many in Congress. As you know, this goes back many years that Congress has taken actions that often the executive branch thought would be counterproductive or provocative. For example, I think it was about 20 years ago when the Senate voted overwhelmingly to give a visa to Lee Dong-wei when he wanted to come to a reunion at Cornell University, if I recall correctly. And of course, the executive branch didn't think that was a good idea. So there's a history of the Congress pushing and the executive branch restraining. And so we'll have to see how this plays out in a Trump administration, which, as you know, can be a very different kind of administration than most in American history. On the other hand, President Trump did seem to learn pretty early on in his first year that these Taiwan-China issues have to be handled very carefully, and so I hope he'll continue to do that now.
Mr. Zhong, though, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, we all have seen some events related to China-U.S. relations concerning the issue of Taiwan, and yet 10 years later, 20 years later, things have changed dramatically, particularly when it comes to the nature of this bilateral relations. Yes, both are big countries, but now China is very different compared to then, and the United States cooperation with China, interaction with China has come to a much higher level than it used to be. So, Mr. Zhong, in this new picture, how is the issue of Taiwan likely to be painted in this bilateral relations?
Comparatively speaking, the Taiwan issue is becoming less and less important in China and the U.S. relationship.
What do you mean by less and less important?
For example, in the past, we often emphasize that Taiwan issue is the most important, most sensitive, and the key issue in Sino and the U.S. relationship. But now, I think both the Chinese leader and the U.S. leaders said this less and less, and we have many interest overlap and many interests intersect. So we have many issues to deal with. In this way, the importance of Taiwan issue is decreasing. So as for now, I don't think the Taiwan issue will become a great issue in China and U.S. relationship. And in future, I think someday maybe United States will abandon Taiwan, and then Taiwan issue will cease to become an issue in China and U.S. relationship.
That is from an expert on the mainland. What about from Taiwan, Ms. Lei? What is your analysis of this nature of relations between China and the United States? In that regard, what is the most smart, or rather the smartest way for Taiwan to find its right spot?
Well, certainly I do believe that a lot of Americans have a soft spot on Taiwan in terms of our system and our political records. However, Taiwan has experienced one strong, abrupt abandonment by the United States. Taiwan was extremely critical to America's critical interests during the Korean War and the ensuing Vietnam War. So we were firmly grounded as an ally. But when the United States decided to build linkage with mainland China, Taiwan's relationship with the United States was severed very abruptly. So I think people in Taiwan are very pragmatic. We understand that the United States will have its own interest, and at times it's consistent with Taiwan's interest, at times it is not consistent. And we must try to build our own independence to an extent, use whatever it can to help Taiwan build its own best interest, and also continue to work with mainland China to secure peace and stability. Because only when there are goodwill across Taiwan Straits, we have greater security across Taiwan Straits.
Mr. O'Hanlon, I remember it was in the year 2003. There was a big event between the United States and China when it comes to the Taiwan issue. Another so-called leader of Taiwan wanted to trespassing the United States. It was a big stir for the bilateral relations. But eventually, President Bush Jr., in the White House, when he was receiving the Chinese leader state visit to the United States, he said very clearly about the U.S. stance, and since then, not much, actually not even much words have changed. But the question really is, how is the United States articulating, particularly now, about its strategy in the Asia-Pacific region, about its own interpretation of what it is in the world? Do you think the latter is going to have any impact on the U.S. way of looking at the Taiwan issue for the near future? Or will more chaotic mix of myths eventually lead us to somewhere dangerous or somewhere safer? Mr. O'Hanlon.
I don't think the United States is going to abandon Taiwan or its other major alliances and friends in East Asia. Obviously, Taiwan is no longer a formal ally. It's not even formally recognized by the United States, as our colleagues were alluding to a moment ago. But even after the United States switched its recognition from Taipei to Beijing, it continued through the Taiwan Relations Act and through military deployments and other activities to remain a fairly steadfast friend of Taiwan. And much of the United States' global role depends on creating and sustaining a strong coalition of like-minded countries that defend each other and that stand by each other's security. It's the whole concept behind NATO. It's the whole concept behind the U.S.-Japan and U.S.-South Korea treaties. And I think that the minute we start letting people question which of our friends we might stand aside as they are somehow coerced by other countries, the whole logic of America's global role, I think, will begin to be called into question, and that will be bad for the whole world. I think it will even be bad for China, because this U.S.-led system has produced the kind of stability that's allowed for China's rise. And so I think the status quo, or something like the status quo for the foreseeable future, is the best answer. And that's why anything like this Taiwan Travel Act does make me a little bit nervous. I hope that whatever change it might produce, if it's passed into law, will be done very incrementally and focus on technical cooperation, not high-level political symbolism.
But you know, Mr. O'Hanlon, here's the thing. you know better than I do that we are mixing a lot of things up over here at this point in the U.S.-China relations. There's, of course, the traditional trade and economic ties, which is now under certain kind of challenge. We're going to talk about that, part of that, in the second part of our program, even today. And there is also the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, which we are seeing some dramatic, at least apparent actions from different sides. And then there's also China and United States. How do they see each other? How do they see each other's role in today's world? So it is a very dynamic, changing time that we are seeing. But that also means opportunities. But really, it also means a lot of dangers. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, how do you see this time? And within this big time, the issue of Taiwan, Mr. O'Hanlon?
Well, that's a very good point. And I guess one thing I would say is that at a time when we have such an unusual American president in the White House, and not a president that I have supported, nonetheless, I am glad to see that President Trump and President Xi are working hard at their personal relationship, because I think that might be, to some extent, a mitigating or softening factor in the otherwise contentious set of issues we sometimes have to deal with. Right. And so I hope they continue to do that. I think that some people questioned why President Trump and President Xi made such efforts to build their relationship, but I think both men were smart to do that, because the relationship needs some ballast. It needs some protection against the various shocks from different directions that may arise, including on the Taiwan issue. And I think if we continue to work in that way, we have two very powerful countries, two very strong systems, and I think we'll find a way to muddle through, but it's going to be tough at times.
Early communication, extremely important for the two countries, and of course, communication at all times as we speak. Ms. Lei, here comes to the question. What does it mean for the island of Taiwan, where you have, apparent controversy between China and the United States on the issue of Taiwan? I guess there are a lot of political factors that are all ready to move as if things are moving in their favor. Ms. Lei.
Well, certainly for the best interest of people in Taiwan, we'd like to gain greater recognition and greater participation in the world. So the current government is trying to push in all fronts, like you alluded to, both Taiwan Travel Act and the WHA-related movements. However, we have also experienced a very long history. We understand that status quo, however fragile the peace and stability might seem, it's still to the best interest of people on both sides. So whoever wants to change status quo, there will be a counterforce pushing it back to move only gingerly, incrementally, and step by step. No one is expecting anyone to move in a dramatic fashion, because that can bring tumultuous time ahead of us, and it can be catastrophic as well.
But
so we understand how stability and peace are fragile, and we must be careful.
Can I just follow up? Because recently on the island of Taiwan, there were quite some political struggles among different parties. And there were cases of the current administration trying to, hold some of the other party members with the excuse of the other party trying to make good or better relations with the mainland. So it seems that it's not quiet before this. So what would this new, kind of change mean for these people? And to what extent do you think they would like to push? And to what extent, as you said, to balance it up, that could happen?
Well, certainly recent actions by the government had sent chills throughout the island. Lots of people felt that the current government is moving towards a very totalitarian state, and feeling that their freedom of speech and expression are in danger. So there are a lot of undercurrents in Taiwan. Therefore, it is very critical that no one moves in a very drastic fashion. The current government also believes that when they claim towards more independent fashion, United States will be their ally, will back their action. So if U.S. continues to send such a signal to the current administration, then they may move in a very aggressive way, and that certainly will send shockwave to the cross-strait relations.
Mr. Zhong, here comes the question to the mainland. What can the mainland do? Protesting against that what the Chinese Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs has already done. So what else can be done to prevent further damage and further dangerous decisions, no matter by whatever branch of the U.S. government?
If the United States proposes a new act or something like that to raise Taiwan issue again, to endanger China and U.S. relationship, I think the Chinese mainland will be compelled to take some new actions. For example, maybe we will stop some high-level official dialogue with the United States, including commercial dialogue, military dialogue, cultural dialogue, educational dialogue, and some other dialogue platform. And if the United States still irritates Chinese mainland, then maybe, for example, the Taiwan Travel Act is passed and signed in future, then the Chinese mainland maybe will be compelled to lower its relationship with the United States. For example, maybe we will call back our ambassador to United States to our home. So I think we have many actions, many measures we could take. So both the United States and China should appreciate our friendship, and we should respect each other's co-interest.
Of course, those are the things that neither side could afford. Before we go, how do you weigh this current latest news, so-called the House passed this specific bill, and it's going to the Senate and eventually to the White House, maybe. Mr. O'Hanlon, final words from you, very briefly.
Very briefly, I think that it's right to debate this, but I don't think we should necessarily worry a great deal yet. There are a lot of ways in which this could be mitigated or slowed or turned into a more technical sort of exchange rather than any dramatic escalation of the high-level political symbolism and contact.
I see. Mr. Zhong, briefly.
I think both the United States and China should appreciate this our long friendship and respect each other's co-interest, especially related to sovereignty and territorial integrity.
And Ms. Lei, final words too.
Certainly, we hope that all parties related take only baby steps, because peace and stability are hard-earned, and it is at a very critical moment.
Baby steps in the right direction, even better. Joanna Lei, Zhong Ho Tao, Michael O'Hanlon, thank you so much for being with us. Have a great weekend. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Chinese smartphone maker Huawei has been blocked from entering the U.S. market after a partnership with AT&T broke down. What do Chinese companies need to prove to penetrate the U.S. market? Some ask.
In this episode of Travelogue, I explore Xiamen's hippest hangouts with my local co-host. Together, we'll discover how this traditional yet cosmopolitan city continues to successfully reinvent itself.
Yes, this is World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday, live on CGTN. China's Commerce Ministry has voiced its concern with America's protectionist policies. The statement was in response to a pair of Chinese companies failing to see agreements with their American partners. The ministry said it hoped the U.S. could create a more positive business environment for foreign investment. Here are the details.
Chinese tech giant Huawei faces another major setback in expanding its U.S. smartphone market. A letter from the U.S. Senate and House Intelligence Committees to the Federal Communications Commission shows that lawmakers are concerned about Chinese companies in the U.S. telecom sector. The lawmakers were especially concerned with the Huawei AT&T partnership to launch consumer products in the U.S. Huawei said that the U.S. market presents unique challenges and that it remains committed to expanding there. Meanwhile, the U.S. has blocked a $1.2 billion sale of money transfer service MoneyGram to Ant Financial, an affiliate of Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba. The deal was nixed by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. for national security concerns. Commerce Ministry spokesman Gao Fang said that it's a shame to see a Chinese enterprise's standard business investment hindered due to so-called national security issues.
We don't oppose Washington's normal security investigations into foreign investment, but we are concerned about the tendency that the U.S. uses national security as an excuse to set obstacles to foreign investment.
The experience of China's tech companies blocked from entering the American market is seen as a wider trend of U.S. protectionism, which is opposed by the international community, including China. Could Washington's appetite for strict regulations serve as opening moves in a trade war? Trump is expected to stick to his America First motto when he addresses the Davos Forum later this month. In contrast, Beijing remains steadfast in pursuing win-win results through China-U.S. cooperation and hopes the two countries will work to create a positive business environment.
For more on China-U.S. trade tensions, well, shall we say tensions or not? We are joined in our Beijing studio, Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Beijing, Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics with the University of International Business and Economics here in China. In New York, we are joined by Max Wolf, Chief Economist from the Phoenix Group. I want to start with you, Mr. Wolf. Of course, it's not the first time, not the second time, not even the third time that Chinese company looking at merger and acquisition with American companies. There's likely to be a problem inside the United States. So the thing is, it is still continuing even today. That is the problem, Mr. Wolf.
Yeah, look, clearly the United States has historically been a champion of free trade. Very disturbingly and problematically, I think we've moved away from that, particularly aggressively with the new administration. And certainly, particularly in my mind, the MoneyGram deal, the national security story around that seems a little bit thin. In terms of Huawei and communications, there are some real concerns when you talk about national communications in any country, but the United States seeks to do business, and we are very active in our tech and communications business around the world, including in China, and we need to open up to others as much as we need and want to be open when we show up trying to do business in other people's homes.
Let's take a look at some numbers just to see what exactly the situation is. China's tech M&A, which is merger and acquisitions, are hitting barriers in the United States, some say, leading to an 87% drop in the investment volume from 2016 to 2017. A report says the total revenues for Chinese mergers and buyouts in the U.S. plunged from $15 billion in 2016 to less than $2 billion in 2017. On the other hand, the 40% of China's exports to the U.S. are generated by American companies operating in China. Those companies have been allowed to set up shop in China under joint venture agreements that require technology transfers from the U.S. parent company. The U.S. is now putting those activities on hold. Okay, those are the numbers, but here's one thing we have to clear up first, Professor Liu, that is, now, these days, China also have its foreign exchange control, which means you cannot move too much of your money overseas, including buying and investing in the United States. Of course, that is as a result of China trying to create a fair environment, both internally and internationally, not to have foreign exchange flight, rather. But having said that, though, does the number that I read to you earlier still ring a bell?
Well, absolutely, yes. China is not really putting a ban on outbound investment. It's just there to streamline the direction. It's not there to buy sports teams, to buy real estate, but they still encourage companies to acquire the technology-intensive companies and also to buy strategic assets.
Right.
So that's, of course, yeah, that's one reason that both policymakers and business leaders are getting really rationalized in decision-making for overseas investment. And on the other, say, the plummeting of this number for merger and acquisition in the United States is really out of the fear and out of the real obstacle presented from the national security review. And now the Huawei case is even more absurd because it doesn't even go for institutionalized review, but simply exercising pressure from those lawmakers onto the FCC and also on the company. So while the U.S. has been pointing fingers to China, so the government is intervening into business decisions. Now what are they doing? So this is really quite a shame, I should say.
Mr. Zhang, trade disputes, it's not rare. In China and the United States, it's already part of the game. But of course, we wish this proportion of the game could be smaller, right? So that the business could flourish. And that is not yet the reality. People say Huawei could be a barometer, because Huawei has been a sensitive name, so-called, to the United States. There were so-called description of it having, army background, having Chinese government relations, but actually all of those are not true, as Huawei has been stating many times. So it has been used as a barometer, or as a, whether it's cloudy or shiny when it comes to U.S.-China trade relations. So what does this case really tell us about the current atmosphere?
Yeah. You know that given that the U.S. is suffering from trade deficit against China, and then when China's investments go to United States, that will make new balance. So that's good thing for the U.S. But I very regret to see Huawei in the past 10 years, in many cases, failed in the U.S. Didn't allow invest in the U.S., including semiconductor companies, three .com companies, 3Ds, something like that. But if you look at Huawei's investment in other countries, for example, in the UK and in so lot of countries in the world, no problems. So I'm afraid that in the U.S., CFIUS, they have their special concerns on telecommunication sectors and semiconductor sectors. Also, there are so lot of politicians in the U.S., congressmen, they have their pay attention on those sectors. But I don't think that any cases cannot get successful. That's a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
If a company does whatever and still could not be successful when it comes to seeking cooperation with business of another country, here is some problem over there. Yeah. Okay, so Professor Wolf, I have to say, we talk about this case not just because of Huawei, not because of just failure this time, but all of these things is happening with a much bigger background. What are the contents of this background? Technology development has become so fast these days. Tech companies like Huawei, like AT&T, are trying to make sure their maps getting bigger and they're having the strongest competitive edges over the others. As a result of that, they would do merger and acquisitions or buyout. Secondly, China and the United States trade relations seem to have entered a new age, as they say, with China becoming more competitive and China-US trying to seek its own status, particularly toward one another. Thirdly, we see this big background of so-called China's trade surplus over the United States. Both sides have been working very hard in order to seek solutions to solve it. So Huawei's case happened with all of these as the background. It makes people think much further than just this specific case. Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, that would certainly be understandable. Look, we have a pattern of decreasing openness to global trade in the U.S., and we have that happening at the same time. The United States has become more aggressive in making accusations of lack of openness against others. And so we sort of spoil the goodwill with our accusations and then further undermine it if we block certain activities. Let's keep in mind also that American consumers have benefited very greatly from the entry of Chinese products and would benefit further from the entry of world-class, competitively priced products from anywhere in the world, including China. So part of the issue for the U.S. in getting this policy right is we need global cooperation, and American consumers need the best product at the best prices, and American businesses need the best products at the best prices. And if we don't have the best products at the best prices, we're not going to fix our trade deficit, which we have with many countries over long periods of time. And there is something a little bit unfair and unbalanced about which countries we tend to make accusations against and which we don't, because we have structural trade imbalances with more than one country.
Professor Liu, there's the issue of so-called national security. So how big really is this issue? How should we understand this issue? Because they say, okay, besides Huawei, as some American politicians would say, you have a so-called background of the government, of the army, which both of which are not true. Yet you also have this so-called data issue. Once you have smartphones produced by China, China could get hold of the data because they think Huawei is working with the government to provide all the data that they have acquired in the phone and feed it back to the Chinese government. There is, though, the issue of security for consumers, for privacy, and also for national security. But the Apple phones are being sold in China, too. So how do you see these debates?
Well, I think this accusation, particularly the accusation for possible espionage, is really totally groundless and even absurd because, you know, yes, mobile phones are communication devices, but they are consumer products. They are not really, you know, the infrastructure for communication. That's number one. Number two is that it is totally competitive market. You have Samsung, you have from China, you even have ZTE, and Oppo is also on the agenda to break into the U.S. market. So it's like a washing machine, like you know, many other headsets. So as for consumer information, you know, it's totally open, and particularly the U.S. has a Free Information Act. So on the other side, when China was accusedly more protective, but we are open to, you know, Apple, to many other global brands in China. So this is really totally groundless. But I think, you know, they have a sort of myopia, I should say, in once they label someone or some institution, they always find trouble with them. So there was a subpoena issue, there was an accusation of a military man issue, but so far there's no evidence to show that you know, this is really landing on any ground. So this is really, I think, it's paranoid.
I guess there should be a campaign against this kind of fake news, right? Let's go to Mr. Zhang about this too. National security is a decent concern for any country. But the question is, how do you do it? You do it by closing the door. You do it by doing unfair trade practices with your other counterparts, or you do it in a smart way and in a way that's really going to guarantee the security of your citizens. There's a sea difference between these two.
Yes.
Mr. Zhang.
Actually, in the U.S., CFIUS is their institution for their, you know, national security issues. But actually, they have, you know, very powerful, you know, this entity is very powerful, and they have right to make decisions. But I think that given the U.S. wants to promote, you know, more balanced economic relationship with Chinese side, we hope that we can promote mutual trust. Without trust, that means we will doubt you and you will doubt China. U.S. doubt China, China doubt U.S.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, there's another dangerous aspect of this, Mr. Wolf, that is, you know, Huawei as a Chinese company, together with many other Chinese companies, have American counterparts. They provide services, they provide certain kinds of technology, they provide certain kinds of devices that eventually would be used in the final products. So further harming of the feelings and the understanding of what the U.S. is about. How much will that really contribute to a should be getting warmer cooperation business environment between Chinese companies and American companies? After all, holding hand in hand doing business, that's going to make bigger money, right? As far as I understand.
Yeah, look, both countries have prospered enormously and become wealthy and powerful working together and trading together. And there is no doubt, by the way, that we would be both poorer and weaker if we could not work together. So that's unambiguous. But I do think that the American public and the American business community needs to take much more seriously changes in rhetoric and some unfortunate decisions will have reverberations and effects, not just in China, but all over the world. After all, China is a very wealthy, very powerful country. The world watches America's relationships, including the relationships with China, and if we don't treat one country right, there's no reason for other countries to believe they won't be next.
All right. Before we go, Professor Liu, I have to say this. Let's just be pragmatic. All the habits die hard, right? We all understand that. So Huawei has been accused once and again and again and again. So what can they do? What can other Chinese companies do? And what can, you know, be the right attitude when we come to business?
Well, the continued presence and the expanded presence of the China made, particularly at the high end, is inevitable and unstoppable in the United States. So after all, you know, the United States cannot really insulate itself from interacting with the whole world in terms of the economic cooperation and also in terms of the consumer buying. So therefore, from the Chinese side, I think, you know, instead of simply complaining, protesting, you know, we do the right work. So now, yes, the AT&T is not allowed to carry. So you can still sell it in the open market as long as your quality of their consumers really have the final vote with their dollar in hand. So that's one. The other is really to find more of those, you know, the local collaborators to have better communication and negotiation with the different stakeholders. It's not only the government agencies.
Right. We hope those will happen, as you say. Thank you so much, Zhang Jianping, and also Mike Wolf, Liu Baocheng. Thank you. Really, thank you for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us. Scroll inside CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. A great weekend, everyone.